Good afternoon. My name is Steve Leavitt, and I'm an evolutionary biologist at Brigham Young University and the curator of the lichen collection at our Life Science Museum. I've been fortunate to study lichens in the Intermountain West for the past 15 to 20 years, and I'm excited to share some of the information regarding Utah's most vulnerable lichen communities. When you hear the word lichens, perhaps you think of sandstone boulders splashed with patches of vibrant colors. Maybe you think of visits to the Pacific Northwest and the temperate rainforest where you see lichens dripping off of trees. You might be surprised to know that here in the state of Utah, we have similar communities here, such as those seen in the slide in a photo that was taken in the LaSalle Mountains. Lichens are abundant and diverse in the state of Utah, and today I'll talk about just a small part of this diversity. Despite the abundance and diversity of lichens in the Intermountain West, these communities face a variety of threats, ranging from wildfires such as the Pat Creek fire in the LaSalle Mountains, shown in the top left image, altered habitats, including the impacts from the introduction of non-native ungulates like mountain goats that are now found in several alpine sites. Lichens can also occur in habitats that have often been seen or traditionally been seen to have little value, and now these habitats are highly degraded, such as the Rich County landfill shown here in these center photographs. Lichens also occur in areas where outdoor enthusiasts and recreation are common, including lichens growing along the popular Slick Rock bike trail just outside of Moab. That's in the bottom left image. Habitat alteration compounded with changing climate is causing changes to lichen communities throughout the state. So what do we have, and what is at risk of being lost, or hopefully better protected? Today, as we consider Utah's vulnerable lichen communities, I want to focus on three main points. Number one, I want to focus on the lichens that rarely occur in Utah, and they represent the edges and most vulnerable populations of what are otherwise more broadly distributed species. The second point is I want to focus on lichen diversity that has previously been overlooked or masked under traditional lichen names. And then for the third point, I want to look at some of those new and interesting lichen species that occur in the state. To help consider these points, I'm planning to focus on lichen communities in the LaSalle Mountains, a sky island on the Colorado Plateau in southeastern Utah. Similar stories of lichen diversity could be repeated throughout the state, and this talk is only intended to give a partial, geographically restricted perspective into Utah's rich and unique lichen diversity. As a sky island jutting out of the Colorado Plateau and with several peaks over 12,000 feet high, the LaSalle Mountains harbor an incredible diversity of habitat types and support interesting plant diversity, including several endemics. And I think a subsequent talk will focus on one of those endemic plant species in the LaSalles. The LaSalles also harbor incredible lichen diversity as well, including some of the most peripheral populations of alpine specialists, including the sausage lichen shown in the top right image and the fine rockwool lichen shown in the bottom right image. These are populations that are not known from the Colorado Plateau apart from the LaSalle Mountains, although they are common alpine specialists that can be found worldwide. These interesting lichens are vulnerable to changing climate and other impacts, and tracking their response can be critical to understanding the impact of change in the state of Utah. So for the first part of this talk, I'm going to focus on three cosmopolitan macrolichens with peripheral populations in Utah that are especially vulnerable to changes in monsoonal precipitation. These lichens are most often found in high altitude montane forests, and tracking and knowing where these populations are will likely be indicative of understanding broader changes to biological communities and the impact of changing monsoonal precipitation. As we look at this map, I'm showing the distribution of three different lichens, with each of these three lichens shown in different colors on the map. The first on the top right is Evernia divaricata. The image in the middle is Ramelinus sinensis, and then the bottom image represents several different Usnea species. So as we look at the Intermountain West, these are broadly distributed species, but on the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, they rarely occur, and when they do occur, they're most often in small, isolated populations. The discovery of these rich, diverse macro-lichen communities in subalpine forests of the La Salle Mountains was somewhat unexpected. Here you can find communities that are on par with those macro-lichen communities that you'd expect to see in the Pacific Northwest. However, the lichen communities in the La Salle Mountains are highly restricted, limiting to only 2 known areas that we have been able to find to date. And these communities are highly vulnerable. One of them was burned nearly completely by the Pat Creek fire, and the other one on the south side of the La Salle Range remains largely intact but still is susceptible to ongoing fire. Similar communities may be found elsewhere in the Uinta Mountains, maybe in the Abajo Mountains near Monticello, and prioritizing the discovery of these sensitive, diverse, and rich macro-lichen communities should be prioritized and monitored to track changes in these incredible sites. As we consider other peripheral populations of macro-lichens, it's become clear that the Aquarius Plateau also harbors some really fascinating communities. Along Pine Creek in the Box Teth Hollow Wilderness area, there are a number of fascinating macro-lichens that have rarely been found in the Great Basin or on the Colorado Plateau, including Letharia lupina on the left and Ramalina intermedia on the right. Both of these macro-lichens occur abundantly in their core habitats and only rarely here in the state of Utah. And the fact that they occur in such abundance in the Box Teth Hollow Wilderness area indicates that this is a unique and unusual site that's worth further investigation and potentially future protection to manage these vulnerable populations. Now, moving away from those peripheral populations of macro-lichens that occur sporadically throughout the state and represent ideal scenarios to assess and monitor change over time, I'm going to focus on the second point of this talk, and that is the cryptic or otherwise previously overlooked lichen diversity that's remained largely uncharacterized. Perhaps one of the best examples of this are members of what's called the Lecanora polytropa complex, or the granite rock speck lichens. This is a group of cosmopolitan lichens that has been known by lichenologists for centuries. It's been well studied. However, diversity in this group has remained largely unknown. Working with a number of students, we've begun some initial investigations into this group and have found some really surprising patterns of diversity. Sampling populations of Lecanora polytropa throughout the world and using genome scale sequencing data, we found compelling evidence that what was once considered a single taxon, Lecanora polytropa, represents more than 100 different candidate species represented in populations worldwide. Interestingly, at local sites, we're finding high levels of species diversity within the Lecanora polytropa complex, and that high level of diversity is often only partially overlapping with nearby mountain ranges. As we sample locally, we're finding that most of the specimens sampled belong to a few cosmopolitan lineages, but at each site there's a higher proportion of endemic lineages that occur more rarely than the cosmopolitan lineages. So for example, in the La Salle Mountains, we've sampled 14 different candidate species representing the Lecanora polytropa complex, with only a few of those candidate species occurring outside of the La Salle Range. These unexpected high levels of species diversity aren't found only within the Lecanora polytropa complex, but they're also found in other really common and well-known lichens that occur in the state of Utah. Another one of these groups are the brown tile lichens, or members of the Lasidia atrobrunia complex. At local scales, you can find a dizzying array of morphological and chemical diversity, and often these have been lumped under a single taxonomic name. And again, working with a number of fantastic students, we have found compelling evidence that what we once thought was a single cosmopolitan species likely comprises dozens of geographically restricted populations or species level lineages with fascinating biogeographic patterns. What this means is as you move from mountain range to mountain range in the state of Utah, each range hosts its own distinct suite of species that are only, again, partially overlapping with an adjacent mountain range. For example, in the La Salle Mountains, we've documented 10 different species of this Licidia atrobrunnea complex. To highlight some of the taxonomic complexities of dealing with cryptic lichen species, I'd like to consider the well-known map lichen, or Rhizocarpon geographicum. This is one of the first lichens that is easy to identify or recognize in the field, and it occurs commonly throughout the state of Utah. With increasing data, including genetic sequence data, we're finding that our previous way of conceptualizing the species is incomplete. And in fact, it looks like Rhizocarpon geographicum does not occur in the state of Utah. Rather, it's a suite of morphological lookalikes that are genetically quite distinct. And how do we effectively characterize that diversity and formally propose robust taxonomy when circumscribing those species remains so difficult from a phenotypic or a traditional taxonomic perspective? The same holds true for Lecanora polytropa, or for members of the Licidia atrobrunnea complex, despite the fact that we can recognize from a genetic sequence data incredible diversity, placing that within a taxonomic content remains quite challenging. All right, finally moving on from the La Salle Mountains and onto the final perspective that I would like to share in this talk, specifically talking about some of Utah's interesting endemic lichen species. While there's been a lot of great work and some really interesting endemics, I'd like to share some brand new science that's just coming out. This is some work that we're wrapping up as we've looked at lichen communities that are associated with playas throughout the Great Basin. These are common communities, important communities, and only recently have we systematically investigated the lichens that occur therein. Work that was led by Jason Hollinger, doing some great stuff. And throughout our sampling, we consistently found two species or two lichens that had not been formally described. One of these we're naming Licania clarii, named after Dr. Larry St. Clair, one of Utah's prominent lichenologists. And the second species we're calling Rhinodyna salinaria, named after the saline playas where it occurs. And these are two beautiful new species, and while they're not endemic exclusively to Utah, they are endemic, as far as we know, to the Great Basin region, highlighting the fact that ongoing research is critical to fully characterize that wide range of diversity within the state. In conclusion, as we consider the vulnerable peripheral macrolichen populations that occur in Utah, the incredible, fascinating cryptic diversity that we're only starting to uncover, and then some of those new endemics that we're able to fully describe taxonomically, we highlight that rich lichen diversity here within the state. I'd like to end with this photograph of a wanderlust lichen. These are imperiled lichens that are found only in the Intermountain West and sage steppe habitats. And this photo is from Rich County, the only known population in the state of Utah. Genetically, it's distinct from all other known populations, and all the populations are under threat. And it showcases the need to continue to work and think and understand to better move forward and manage and appreciate diversity of lichens here in the state. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions. Feel free to email me to continue on with any discussion. Thank you.